Well, whenever you're ready, Tom, we'll get
Yeah,
started.
let me share my screen. Well, what I wanted to do is start out with just any questions that anybody, I know this is your session number 5, you say, or
Yeah,
out of 6. And so we're going to be talking about the pests, and probably since gardening, well, it started a little bit for those of you who are doing winter gardens, but maybe you haven't dealt with any pests, at least this year yet. But can you recall anything that you fought in your gardens or thought or realized in your garden? Anybody? We could just shout out anybody if you want to hit your space bar or just something.
type it in chat and I'll read them.
Yeah, type them in chat. That's always the best way to do it. And I guess we're recording, so sometimes when you're doing the recording, it's better to, put most things in chat. That way it'll, well, the recording will be a little smoother.
Bowls and voles. We discussed those a little bit last week.
That's right. I don't know if I've got that in this one. I usually put that in most of my talks, bowls and voles. Anyway, the Tennessee Vegetable Garden Plant Pests. This is an introduction to all the pests, and I try to enhance it a little bit. You can see up above there's a little worm that gets in there, the European corn borer. There's the anthracnose, the pepper. It's just ugly looking pepper. A lot of people know what that one is, the hornworm on tomatoes. Here's one that looks pretty nasty on cantaloupe. Don't know if I've ever seen that exactly, but I know I've seen other things in cantaloupe, usually on the outside. And then Phytophthora blight is a very nasty one on squash. And there's other things down here. I don't know what the name, I thought I had names on those, but anyway, that's a virus. And there's a bean beetle, I think that's what that is, and some spots, and nematodes on carrots, and another, I think that's a bacterial spot on cabbage. So let's get into it here. So we're going to talk about diseases first, basically. And when you talk about diseases, we talk about fungi primarily, different fungi that get in, and usually they land on plants, and we'll talk about that. And then there's also bacteria, which are much smaller than fungi. They're single-celled organisms, and they usually need some kind of injury to get inside a plant. And then there's viruses. We know all about viruses, right? I mean, we know human viruses, but there's also lots of viruses that can infect plants. And there's actually a lot of take-home messages with controlling viruses in plants. You have to a lot of times you have to get rid of them very quickly. A lot of times you have to rogue out or take out the plants. There's no vaccines for viruses in plants. So we'll cover those a little bit too. The nematodes are little worms. They're very tiny. If you ever had a compost pile and just saw the little tiny worms, not the big earthworms, excuse me, but the little tiny worms that you can barely see with your eyes, those are nematodes, but the ones that get on plants are even a little bit smaller than that. But you can see them barely, and you can see them fairly good with a microscope. And then insects, there's big ones and smaller ones, and they're usually easier to see, the insects. But these other ones, the spores and the bacteria, are very difficult to see. So a lot of times what we're doing is we're looking at symptoms. And symptoms are just like, okay, we've got a cough, that we have a flu or something. That's a symptom. But we go to the doctor, and the doctor takes a culture of our throat and determines if it's a virus or a bacteria. Kind of the same thing with plants too. We see some nasty spots on all these different things here, and those are symptoms. But if you look really close, let's say this spot right here, if you sent this to me, which a lot of people do, then what I would do is I'd scrape a little bit of this off, almost like a culture, and I put it on a little glass slide, and I've got a microscope that I can hone it right in and see what that is. Now, when I teach Master Gardener classes, I tell them that most of you aren't going to have a microscope to do what I do, but that doesn't mean you can't diagnose it. You don't have to be as smart as a medical doctor, and you don't have to really be able to look at the spores. Most of the time with anything with plants, especially vegetables, they're going to be very, very diagnostic. So let's say here's a watermelon, and how would you figure that out if you were just starting out? The way I recommend people, and I even teach a class on this, is you Google it. You basically say, you type in the Google, and Google, you could use Bing or some of the other search engines, but Google seems to be really good at scientific stuff. So I go into Google, just regular Google, and I'll type watermelon spot or watermelon brown spot. I'll just try to describe it the best I can, and then I'll see what comes up. Usually you get a million choices, right? But what often happens, and there's even better ways, you can say brown spot .edu, which means you hopefully will get quite a few educational sites, which means you'll get hopefully university sites. But you can still go through it even if you just say spot watermelon, and then you look and see. And oftentimes you'll find North Carolina, or maybe you'll run into Tennessee, maybe Mississippi, and then maybe it'll be somewhere nearby. And then they'll give you a bunch of pictures of watermelons. And then maybe one spot will look like this, maybe another spot will look like this one over here. I'm not exactly sure what that one is either. They don't have that named, but different things. What I'm saying is you would pick the plant first. If this is tomato, then a lot of times you can do picture. It's almost like picture book time, and that's good enough for plants. Here's some of the things you might run into. This is leading up to what are the choices. If you cut it right in half, right down the middle here, these could be called diseases, but generally they're called disorders because they're not bacteria and fungi, nematodes, what we just talked about. They're things like air pollution, maybe chemicals were in the air, maybe the soil was bad, maybe the nutrients were bad, maybe there was too much water and that caused low oxygen, or drought, or heat, or mechanical, something that happened. Maybe something happened that impacted. Maybe it was a hailstorm that caused a mechanical impact. But then on this side, you could go all the way from insects, mites, nematodes, all these things. And most of the things we're going to talk about today are on this side right here. At least we're going to get a good view of that. And then there's injuries, disorders, disease. So let's see what else. Now here's the first thing, the abiotic causes. And usually, well, here's a little bit, this is a slide I usually show. It's a little bit easier to see than the other one, but water could either be flooding or a drought, too much or too little, temperature. Sometimes in the spring we have a freeze. Sometimes in the summer it gets so hot. So these are things that are non-living. That's what abiotic means. The soil type isn't right. Nutritional things aren't right. High salts. A lot of those things you find from the soil test. And I'm sure you had that earlier on. You found out about the pH. Or at the middle part of the year, maybe you're putting on pesticides and you're actually causing damage to the plant. You're not doing that properly. And those could be called abiotic because there's no fungi involved here. And a lot of times people like a visual. I like to see things sort of in a visual manner. And you could say what plant, any plant, and the environment. And there's just two things going on. And so let's say it's windy and it's causing holes in your plant, or rain, too much or too little, hailstorm, pH or temperature. And it's pretty easy, you might say, to say these things cause this on our plant. But then the next step would be talking about adding a third thing, and that's where we get into what we call the disease triangle. We've got the pathogen or the pest. We got the environment, like we had in the last slide. Well, let's go backwards. We got the host, that's the plant. We've got the environment. The thing we didn't have in the last slide was the pathogen or the pest. And the reason they make this, somebody was smart that they made this into a triangle. And the thing about it is there's different ways of looking at this. And the way I was taught is that, okay, you got, let's say this is standing up by itself. So if you wanted to make this fall down like a deck of cards, you know, like when you build a little house out of cards, you pull the one thing that could make it less or make it less disease. In other words, if you sprayed for that pathogen, that would all crash down and you wouldn't have disease. That's kind of the way it was. Or let's say the environment, you did the same thing. You made sure you watered with a trickle irrigation instead of overhead irrigation, and so you didn't cause more disease. Or over here, maybe you used resistant varieties, or maybe you just decided not to even grow that squash that always gets disease. So you decided just to take care of that part of the triangle. So that's one way of looking at the disease triangle. The way I like to look at it, or another way of looking at it, is circles. You know, we've got the host, we've got the environment, you've got the pathogen, and if they're in different fields, you aren't going to have problems. But if they come together, then if they get in the right environment, sometimes the disease gets big right in there. So now the trick, if they're the person that's good at visual, you'll say, what can I do to make that red smaller? And you can pick any one of these things. Again, you can say, well, I'm not going to grow that plant, so I'm just going to take that one out of there. And then that basically, let's just act like that makes the disease go away. Or if you can spray, or let's say you do something to make that pathogen less. Let's say you pull that, you don't really take it away, but maybe you spray just enough and your sprays work a little bit, so it pulls that circle down a little bit further. So let's say it pulls it down to here, and so you got less disease. Maybe you pull it down to here or here. Chances are you can't get rid of it all because you don't want to spray, that much. Same thing with the environment. Pick anything in the environment, and there's chances are that you can do something to make that less. So that's just a nice visual to tell you what to do and how to solve it. Here's another little picture of that triangle, because it's important to kind of know here's how you would handle the pests in that circle. You'd either maybe crop rotation would help, protection chemicals, solarization, maybe that might help. Biofumigation means you had some kind of material that you could incorporate into the ground that would give you, that simulate a chemical going into the ground, fumigate. Seed treatments, maybe you'd buy good seed. You could also plow under residue, that might help. Roguing means you pull out the bad plants. Pruning out the pests. Control other pests, maybe get rid of the insects and they're transmitting diseases. Make sure you buy good transplants, clean the equipment. All these things will help the pest. What about here on this side? Yeah, use resistant varieties, or don't grow this crop. Yeah, or the environment. Maybe you got to pick a good site where you're going to get good sunny areas. If you have a place where it's going to get wet, or a bad place for the soil, that's the environment. Maybe you're going to plant too many plants. I always plant too many tomatoes and they get crowded. So think ahead and either take them out when they get crowded and just sacrifice because you're going to get plenty of crop anyway, or think ahead and just plant 4 tomatoes in your raised bed instead of 8 like I usually do. Irrigation, we talked about that. Maybe always underneath is always going to be better than overhead. However, sometimes if you've got a pretty good sized garden, putting in a trickle irrigation is not practical or a little bit harder, whereas you can just set up a sprinkler. But then you'd want to modify that, do it at the time of day where you'd get the plants watered, but the plants or the leaves would dry out so that you wouldn't get a fungus started. Raised beds could help with pests because it gets it up off the ground. You can pick out the weeds a lot easier. You can add some organic matter that might help. So you can see right here, there's just all these ways that you can do. And when you talk about chemicals, here we are right here. That's the only thing that most people, university sometimes recommends certain pesticides. And if you're an organic grower, that's the only thing you're missing right there. Everything else, farmers do this all the time. And so even people who do organics have organic chemicals that they allow to put in the organic field. So organic, yeah, it's good, but everyone who does good gardening is doing almost everything that's necessary. You can't, in other words, you can't control pests without doing almost all these things. And now here we talked about symptoms, and those are kind of what things look like. But here's the nitty gritty, the signs of a pest. These are actually the spores. The yellow part, yeah, that's symptom. But when you touch it and can look at the spores individually almost, that's when you've got a sign. And so then here's the threads, and you look real hard and you go, no, that's not a spider web. Those are the spores of here it is, a turf fungus. Or here's something you're going to see on cedar pretty quick. And it looks like, no, it's not a fruit, it's a fungus. And then here's a turf that has a ring of toadstools. They call it a fairy ring. And then here's a tree with some fungi sticking out of it. So those are signs because you can actually see the pathogen. So these are living, they're biotic, they're not abiotic. And mostly we talk about are nematodes, fungi, bacteria, and viruses. And most of the time, that's why I threw that in, because you have to look at them under the microscope to really see them. And there's the worm and the nematodes, the spores of the fungi. Bacteria are really small, and viruses, it's almost like 10 times. Fungi are going to be 10 times smaller than these little worms. Bacteria are going to be like 10 times smaller than the fungi. And the viruses are going to be probably more than 10 times than the bacteria. They're very, very small. But you can see them. Not with a microscope like this. You have to look at them with what they call electron microscope. Some of those real weird pictures you see of COVID-19 that they take with stains and things. I don't think COVID is really red, but they show all those cool little structures. Well, plant viruses are the same looking a lot of times. There's rods and there's round ones, things like that. So there's some cool looking viruses. And a lot of the virus work early on was with plants. It's a lot easier to play around with plants and get viruses to figure out how they infect plants and use the same principles. To my knowledge, I don't think there's any plants. There's always never say never, but I don't think there's any plant viruses that can infect humans. Very few, if any. So here's plant pests. Here it shows a cucumber that looks pretty nasty, and that's caused by what they call anthracnose. So if you think about that name, anthracnose, anthrax, it takes you back to a cattle disease called anthrax. And there's probably a story there somewhere, I think, historically, but it basically, to me, it means it's a little bit worse or quite a bit worse than just spots. Spots are more defined, anthracnose is a term that given to a disease and that looks a little bit, well, quite a bit worse. It kind of gets bigger, like a spot started there, but now they all coalesced and got quite a few spots. So what do you do about that? Yeah, you've got to decide. There's going to be a lot of control measures, and it kind of goes back to what we were talking about in the first few slides. Here's a striped cucumber beetle, and that one can be on a lot of different things. I think that's the same one that can be on corn too. So some insects, some diseases can be on multiple crops. Like anthracnose of cucumber probably would definitely be on all the things that are related to cucumber, all the cucurbit type crops. And so Ken and Ruth, somebody raised their hand. I don't know if you're going to put something in chat or want to speak.
Well, on that cucumber that you're showing, you say the disease is called anthracnose.
Yes.
Now, when you have vegetables with the diseases like that, how will you control it? Are you like burn it, throw them away, or remove all the whole plant so it doesn't contaminate the other plants? What would you recommend?
Right. Okay, here's the way to handle that. And the very first thing is to identify what that problem is. And the reason, there's no one size fits all. Everything's going to be a little different, depends on the problem. Like anthracnose, for instance, is a disease that usually gets on the leaves first. And so the leaves get a spot and it coalesces. And then this is one that would get really bad if you were overhead irrigation. And so it would splash from the leaves and it would splash on the fruit. And then later on, almost as these fruit are getting bigger, and that's what usually happens. The leaves, as it's growing, maybe from last year, you had a little bit of disease. So last year you noticed it, and maybe you weren't really big on spraying for it because chemicals do work on these things. Farmers, commercial people do, but usually homeowners don't do it, and I don't spray too much for diseases. So way back, let's say you get burned one year, and that means you learn a lesson. And so the next year, you're going to maybe plant your cucumbers in another part of your garden. If you've got a big enough garden, you wouldn't plant cucumbers back in the same area. Or you would pull out all the vines and throw them in your compost pile. This is usually not going to, it's usually going to decay to the point where it's not going to spread, especially if you have a fairly good compost pile. You don't have to have a perfectly hot compost. Usually if you have a lot of good bacteria, and all those good creatures in your compost pile, this will just turn to nice compost if you leave it there for 3 to 6, or a year, whatever. Compost piles, if you're just using regular compost, you need to be it hot. So then you could spray. That's part of the deal. If you want to, you'd spray the leaves so that the leaves would not get worse and the spores would not go onto the cucumbers. So you see what I'm doing. And a lot of times when you first, let's say you were growing cucumbers, and usually it happens in your 3rd year. I don't know, not always, but usually the first year you have a garden, you don't have many problems at all because the pathogens didn't come from anywhere. And so where did this pathogen come from? Sometimes it's hard to say. Sometimes it comes from a crop that's either nearby. Maybe it came from a neighbor and it blew in on the wind. Maybe it came from a crop that was similar. Sometimes weeds or insects come from crops that are related. So that's where you go. And we'll get into that a little bit with control measures as we go on, but that's a good question. Here's the pathogens. And here's plant pathogens. We got a nematode. Here's virus particles. Here's a representative fungi. And there's a bacteria right there. A lot of times bacteria, well, there's rods of bacteria. And sometimes there's circles. But basically, okay, there's a lot more fungi. See, there's 10,000 fungi, 100,000 bacteria, viruses. So look at how many viruses there are. I think sometimes we really haven't discovered all these pathogens, just like we've got COVID-19 is new to us. So I think there's probably new things that pop up from time to time that people discover on their crops. I know in my lifetime, in my work time, we've seen quite a few new diseases on trees and vegetables and things that really are a scourge, almost like we don't call them a pandemic, but we do call them an epidemic of different things. Sometimes they get transported from different countries. We've had a lot of times when we get a fungi that come in. Usually it's on more crops or trees and shrubs that we get from other places. There's a lot of stories that come from that we get. Let's say we get a shipment of tulips or flowers from the Netherlands, for instance, and they might have something on their bulbs. And next thing you know, we might get them here. However, there's a lot of controls on that too. Like the Netherlands, they'll have plant inspectors to make sure nothing transports out of their country. And we'll have inspectors in the United States to keep that from happening. So I was just talking about new things, but we have our share of things that we send to them and they send to us. And there's a whole bunch of things that we could actually call native fungi, native bacteria, things that have been around forever that we just haven't seen. Very cool. That's why I got into plant pathology, because you can talk about the history, you can talk about the biology, you can talk about the dynamics, the epidemiology. There's a real microscope world. It's really a fantasy type thing when you think about it. This is a good slide that I like to talk about, where in the old days, no one knew where that fungi came from, or that toadstool. A lot of people call it a toadstool. Some people think that it was mysterious, that especially the Irish, if you go back in the culture there were a lot of mystical things that went on. Some people thought that the old Irish fairies would get together and dance around these things or dance on top of these things. You know, they just didn't know where this all came from. And basically it came from that fiber in the soil. There's good bacteria. I mean, there's good fungi. I would say there's 99% of the fungi in the soil is good, and the 1% can cause disease. Same thing with bacteria, same thing with viruses, same thing with nematodes. Most all of it is going to be very beneficial to our life and our plants. And these little parts that get on our plants and cause us stress and whatever are, you know, if you were thinking about what's beneficial and what's bad, it's kind of like personal. You know, the world or Mother Nature doesn't care. I mean, they're just trying to break down material, but we care because we want to eat that crop, and we don't like it, the fungi getting on there. So, okay, here's characteristics. They're multicellular. That means they're not just one cellular like bacteria. They form structures. They have spores. They're very, very hard to get rid of. You know, if you're talking about how to control these things, sometimes you can't do it very well in this right here, because these are survival structures. They're very hard. They're almost like little seeds, and they'll overwinter in the soil. And you can get rid of the crop, but if But if you had a really bad year with this, then these little seeds, and they're just fungal seeds, and this is the term, but then when the conditions get right the next year, they'll sprout and start all over again. Here they go. There's the little starting pieces right there. It turns into this, these threads, and these threads start making these spores. Well, here's the threads right there. Sometimes they come up with beautiful, beautiful structures. I say beautiful. I don't know if I've got pictures, but I do have other pictures of how nice they are. And this is where a scientist would identify it, but you and me might identify it by seeing these little things on our crop, or maybe we'd see this going through. And every fungi is a little different. Here's some of the ones that you'll see: stem rot, which is on the stem, crown rot, lesions on the leaves. I sometimes kid that there's probably a disease on every vegetable, and there's probably a problem on every part. There's going to be something on the roots, there's going to be something on the leaves, on the stem, different things. So there's names that are given. Don't be thrown off by all these Latin names. Most of these are Latin names, but a lot of times they're also the common names because they haven't come up with a, like that name right there is very important in fungal, but most of the time we just call it a root rot or a crown rot. So don't get thrown away by the names. If you do it long enough, you'll kind of just pick them up, just like you learn names of people. And here's another comical thing that I throw in there. If you call that a tomato plant, let's say, but all the leaves look like different things, like that looks like a maple. And so this is sort of everybody's plant, right? And so you've got things that go on. There could be galls on the roots. There could be just a rot down here. There could be something else right here. This is where the crown is. A lot of times that's a really vulnerable spot for vegetables, because if you water too much, the water gets right around this area here, and it could cause a spot or a rot. That's what they call crown rot. Or there could be a lesion. Maybe it would happen right there. Or maybe there's a spot on the fruit or a spot on the leaf. You could see maybe, oh, it's drooping. And why is it drooping? Well, maybe there's fungi or bacteria inside the stem that's choking the plant. So all kinds of things. This is witch's broom. And so they call it a witch's broom because it just looks like some witch had come in there and just made it all look crazy. And so when you try to figure out what it is, you use common words. You know, I would say, okay, if this is a tomato, I would say tomato leaf spot if it was on there. Or I would say tomato root rot. Or I would say tomato wilt if my plant looked like that. And I would do the same thing for peppers, or in some cases I say this is a tree, and just say, so what I'm saying is that no plant has everything, but every plant has quite a few things. This is one very sick plant if it had all these things. And usually it's one or two at a time. Usually if let's say tomato is wilting, there's all the names right there. So if usually one year you'll have leaf spots, and maybe you'll find some different types of tomatoes that won't get leaf spots, but then maybe they'll be more prone to wilting, or maybe they'll be rotted, they'll get rots. Or maybe one year it's going to be wet, one year is going to be a little bit different. And so you might get, one year it might be real dry and you won't get very many of these diseases at all, but you'll have to water more often. This is kind of the way a fungi work. That spore, that round spore, germinates just like a seed germinates, and then it has to find a place to get in. So it can, fungi can go right into a plant. Sometimes it goes into these little holes in a plant called stoma, or stomates. So this is basically, so this is the plant down here. This is like the skin of the plant, the epidermis. A lot of times it has a waxy area on the top, so it has to get through that. Spores don't do this that easily. And that's why if you irrigate in the morning and it dries out, let's say that spore landed on some nice wet tissue because it stormed last night. And so it grew this little germination tube. And let's say it took 3 hours. It started growing 3 hours, and it takes 4 hours to get to here. So now you water it in the morning and it's starting to dry out, dry out, dry out. So it stops. So maybe there was 10,000 spores that landed on your leaf and everything dried out by noon. And so nothing happened here, no infection occurred. So this is a very good picture of how that happens. But let's say you didn't water it. Let's say you watered later at, let's say you came home from work and you watered that night because things looked a little dry. And then it rained again during the night. So let's say you watered at 5 o'clock at night and you were expecting it to dry off a little bit, but it got dark and it was cooler. So the spore kept on growing, and then it rained in the morning. So you got at least 5 or 6 hours of wetness, and then it can occur out of the, let's say out of the 10,000 spores that landed, 5,000 of them germinated and made it. It's a numbers game. So that's how fungi get a hold. And so that's how they get in. So these things can spread by wind, water. They need a lot of water to get around. See all these that made it? They need soil a lot of times. They need plant material. And a lot of times it's spread by equipment. Sometimes people don't pay attention. They might be in their garden when it's wet and they have a little disease. So they're using their hands to maybe either pick, or maybe they're just trying to, I don't know, stake them up or do something. They shouldn't be there when it's all wet because they're moving around the spores just by handling the plant. So you want to be careful with that. You can see where every spore landed here, it caused a little, and there's little ones started there. So you want to try to be aware of that with fungi anyway. Here's one that probably was caused because they were doing the right thing. They were mulching with a little newspaper and maybe some straw around it, but it looks like maybe it was too close to that stem, and that newspaper kept wet all the time. And so then that stem never dried out. It was nice and wet all the time. And this is a real common problem in a lot of plants. You want to make sure that you keep a couple inches away so that you don't have wetness all the time. You want to be able to water it, but you want to be able to dry it out too. Same thing for mulching trees. It's nice to have mulch around the trees, but you don't want to have the mulch piled up next to the trunk of the tree because it just keeps this part too wet and it leads to decay. So a lot of these little things make a difference. There's really no spray for this problem. It's too late to really survive or save that type of plant. Some of the ways you manage, somebody was talking about, and we covered a lot of this already. The first thing would be to, if you wanted to manage a disease, the first thing you might want to look for just resistant. There's a lot of resistance in tomatoes and peppers these days, but they may not be the varieties that you like. You might like a certain variety of tomato, and if you look at it, it might not do well in your yard because you have too much disease, and you find out that, hey, every time I plant that variety, it's just not going to work in my place. So you look for a cultivar that might be resistant to a leaf spot or a root rot or something. You want to make sure you have clean seeds in stock. Go to a nursery if you're buying your little seedlings, or make sure you go to a place and look them over, and they're reputable and they're taking good care of their little seedlings. Make sure your equipment is clean and your hoses. If you're watering with a hose, make sure You're not leaving it on the ground so that bacteria and fungi can get inside that hose, especially if you're starting out with a greenhouse. You want to have good drainage and good air flow in your garden. Crop rotation, yeah, you want to, if you can. Not everybody can do that. Somebody asked, I think today in one of my classes, should you rotate every year? And I would say that maybe you can't do it every year. I would base it on what happened in this year. If you started to see some diseases and things, you may want to change crops, put your tomatoes in another box or a bed. You know, some of these things are spores that are going to blow around, but if you've got the residue right there, it would help to have them at least a little 5-10 feet apart. So that could help with rotation. If you can't rotate, then maybe add some compost, add some really good soil, some composted stuff, and work it in and kind of change the soil. Make sure that top layer of soil is incorporated, not necessarily with a rototiller. You don't always have to get it real deep. You can just kind of scratch it and let your compost do some of the work. So, like, again, one size doesn't fit all on these things. Sometimes you won't run into problems. Sometimes you just can't rotate like a farmer could or should. Then there's biological management. I think we'll cover this a little bit. Sorry about that. That's biological control. There's some ways to control certain pests with some kind of biological material or chemical. And then here's where some of the effective fungicides might work. There's quite a few compared to what we're going to talk about, viruses and bacteria. There are fungicides that you could use. I try to teach people to stay away from them. I mean, they're not that dangerous, and they're very effective if you want to use them, especially if you're getting a little bigger time in your garden. You can use them very effectively against leaf spots, not so good against rots and root rots and things like that. But consider those or read up on them before you decide to either say no to that. A lot of people say, no, I'm not going to use any kind of fungicides. Well, maybe the same thing applies to insecticides, and you get run over by some creatures that come in. Same thing with fungi. You get burned one year, and the next year you're going to say, well, maybe I can just put on 1 or 2 sprays early on while the plant is growing, and that usually can solve it. Maybe you just need to stake up your tomatoes and make them higher, or I'm using tomatoes because we all have tomatoes, but make them so they don't droop down. Sometimes people even prune their tomatoes to make them so they're more open, so they'll get more airflow through there and reduce the fungal possibilities, and thus they don't need the chemicals. So a lot of tricks of the trade in gardening. There's a bacteria. Wow, that looks so big, but that's so small. There's different shapes of bacteria. They're one-celled. Some are spirals, some are bacilli, kind of rectangular, some are rounded. There's not as many diseases, but some of them can be very nasty. They can rot really quickly, and they can smell. Bacteria, it's like smelling. Well, usually a compost pile has a lot of bacteria, but it usually smells fresh because it also has a lot of fungi and good smelling things. Usually rotted fruit don't smell that great. Sometimes people ask, how do you tell the difference between a spot or a rot that's bacterial versus one that's fungal? Sometimes it's not that easy, but a lot of times you'll see little tiny spores. I don't know if I pointed them out when we were looking at some of those spots, but let's say there's a spot, and then inside a fungal spot, you'll see little bodies where those spores are being produced. Whereas with a bacterial spot, you'll just see a spot that's kind of getting bigger and bigger and bigger. a little bit, but you won't see the spores. And there's different types. And sometimes it's hard to tell. Again, if you're picking out a plant, let's say tomato, when you type in tomato spot, you'll probably get 3 or 4 choices. And the one that's called speck is a little, it's a little one. And then there's spot, there's a tomato spot, it's a little bigger. And then there's a canker. So by just looking at the pictures, sometimes you can compare that to what you have. And sometimes it does make a difference. Sometimes there's certain recommendations for speck versus spot. Let's see, wide range. Yeah, there could be several. Yeah, they could have more than one. Usually, in my experience, you'll either have a certain one on tomatoes. You'll definitely, and again, they don't cross. They stay like this. Brown spot will be on beans, if it's there. A lot of times it comes from the previous year. Maybe it just started. Sometimes it comes from seed. You get bad seed, and it's actually intertwined inside that seed. When it breaks open, you've got bacterial. So it's good to get or buy certified seed, which means that somebody sold you the seed that either they knew that it was really clean and they were able to sell it to you. Most seed companies do that. They have somebody on their staff that grows the seed in a greenhouse, and so they can assure their customers that it's pretty well clean before it goes out. Here's some good pictures. Bacterial wilt of tomato. So that bacteria, that's a really nasty one. It gets in the stem and it just causes that whole plant to wilt right down. It'd be hard for me even to figure out what that exactly was. I think I would go to the pictures. I would just say, what's going on? Here's good tomato, bad, 2 good tomatoes, but right in the middle, it's wilted. So my control measure right now would be just to pull that out, carefully bag it up, get it out of the field, and then watch real carefully for what's going on there. If I really wanted to pay a little bit of money, I would send it up to Sheldon could help you do this. You could send it up to the lab in Nashville, and maybe they could help you diagnose that particular problem. It would cost $15 to kind of do that. I don't know if I would do it the first time I saw it, unless I was selling tomatoes. I'd be a little afraid. But if it happened, if it started going 1, 2, 3, and it scattered throughout, then I would be a little bit worried, and maybe I'd try to get it diagnosed. There's another tomato, or that's a wilt. And again, I mean, that actually they misnomer. They didn't. This is not a bacterial. This is a fungal wilt on tomato, but it works kind of the same way. And you see just one plant out of several, and it's probably in a wetter area. You can diagnose things a little bit. You could say, well, these over here are a little bit drier. This one just happens to be in a wet. You could even find some, maybe this is a different variety of tomato. And then you'll discover that that one just didn't have the genetics to overcome this verticillium, which the fungi actually get in. That's the same. That's what happens here too. The bacteria get inside the stem and choke off all the vascular tissue. And there's bacteria. Actually, the bacteria is this right here. They took a little piece, probably they took a little piece of, I'd guess, cucumber, and put that under a slide. And it's not easy to see. This is a kind of a special microscope, but you can see it on a regular microscope. And it just is, these are just streaming bacteria. You can't really see one bacteria, but you can just imagine that that's a million. I would say there's probably a million bacterial spores in this little piece right there. There's sometimes some of the bacteria with cucumbers, you can take 2 cut stems and stick them together. I try it a lot. It doesn't always work. because a lot of the bacteria, some of them have some stickiness to it. So you stick them together and you can pull them apart. If you can pull them apart and still see kind of they're still stuck after about even a half an inch, that means it's not just plant sap. That's probably bacteria that's sticking together, especially if you do that on a wilted plant that's just, well, you know that it's not perfectly dead yet. It still has sap in it, but you suspect that it has this bacterial canker. So bacteria usually get into these little holes or in the plant called stomates. A lot of times they need wounds to get in. Sometimes the insects make the wounds or basically inject bacteria with their mouth parts, and they require water. So that's, again, a reason to be real careful about blasting your plants with overhead irrigation. Always try to water underneath if you can. Here's a little leaf hopper that can lead to some bacterial, some survival. Oh, how do bacteria survive? A lot of times they'll just decline if the host is taken away. You know, that means if you clean up at the end of the year, a lot of the bacteria won't stick around. Some will stick around on dead tissue. So if you leave it in the ground or on the ground, sometimes it'll just linger on the dead part. Sometimes it'll linger on the live, if there's surface plant still there. And sometimes it survives in the soil. So that's another reason. There's no one size fits all on how to control it, but it's good to, first identification is key. What disease you have, look it up on the internet, look on bulletins, and figure out what's your strategy going to be. Maybe you need to turn in the tissue. Maybe you need to take it right out, take those plants right out of the ground. Like I said, with that wilted, it's a good thing to do while the crop is going there. At the end of the year, it's usually a good practice to pull the plants out and throw them in the compost pile, but not always. Sometimes you can just chop it up and stick it right back in as extra nutrients. Controlling bacteria, get good cultivars, resistance, rotate, make everything clean, disease-free. A lot of the same things, almost exactly the same, until you get down to the chemical stuff. There's not that many options for fungal. They often say use coppers, which is just copper, you know, probably ground up certain types of copper into and it's a fungicide. Copper was the old chemical. Most of these chemicals would be called organic. You could still use them because they're natural, and so they're on that organic list, and they would do some good on certain things. Again, certain spots and things, they've been used for ages, but be aware that they will get washed off. They don't always last very long, and they can build up. Like organic growers who use coppers a lot, they can build up in the ground and just be, basically you've got a lot of copper in your crop. I'm not sure how prevalent that is, but that's one concern there. And then antibiotics is just like we would control a sore throat with antibiotics. There are certain ones that can be used for bacteria. However, again, homeowners, not so much, because we're trying to think that, you know, the bacteria, again, aren't going to be ones that we have to worry about, but the chemicals are very similar. So if the chemicals become resistant to this bacteria, sometimes they can become resistant to the bacteria that might infect humans. At least that's the fear. Again, I don't know. I know there's a disease in apples called fire blight, and it's one of the chemicals that can really only fight that bacterial disease is a streptomycin, which is a chemical we use. So farmers are told not to use it unless they really have to, because we don't want to have that floating in the air and maybe a possibility of becoming resistant to our throats. Now here's viruses. Everyone should be interested in viruses, right? And here's rods. You know, COVID is a round one, and there are round plant viruses. They're not a living organism, surprisingly. Sometimes I wonder, I mean, they really are just a chunk of DNA, or I think it's even RNA, which is, but anyway, they're large molecules. They're not even a cell. They multiply in a host. They need a host cell to multiply. They're just basically a protein and a nucleic acid. They're very small. There's even a viroid, which is even smaller yet, which has no protein coat, but acts like a virus. So I don't know if we have any viroids that attack humans. There might be. Some of the symptoms, these look like from outer space because they really can morph the plant, the look of a plant. They can stun it. They can make it yellow. A mosaic, which is, it just has yellow, green and yellow, green and yellow, green and yellow. In the old days, these tulips were thought to be, they didn't know what viruses were, obviously, back in the, I think in the 1500s, or when was it, 16. I tell this story about the Dutch were very into their bulbs, and they saw these from someplace. Maybe it was, I can't remember the vector, maybe it was some insect that inserted these, probably aphids. And somebody found that they got a bunch of these, and so they saved the bulbs and said, hey, for the price of your horse, I'll give you 10 of these. And so the guy said, yeah, gladly, because I can sell them for twice that on the market. So there was sort of a stock market crash, you might say. Well, they didn't find out then that that was a virus, but people were trading these things for ungodly number or amount of money back in the ages where they saw this first. And over the years, scientists are able now to make tulips like this without the virus. They were able to just play around and get some really cool looking tulips. All kinds of stories. Here's a very common one in tomatoes. It's this is actually transported by an insect or infected by an insect. Here's a mosaic virus. Some of these can be just spread by insects. They can be spread by beetles. They can be spread by humans touching. Just a lot of different things. Here's how fungi spread. Fungi spread, there's a spore that lands on a leaf, and then it grows and makes two, then it goes on the leaf, then the wind blows and it goes to another leaf. Whereas here's how viruses spread. A virus particle lands on a leaf, and the next thing it takes over that leaf, the cell, and it goes into the plant. It becomes systemic. It may go down the roots, it may go up the plant, and next thing you know, it's in the whole plant. So you can't, there's no chemical to control this. They've been working on making immune plants and different things over the years, and they probably got some headway in that, but really there's no real big way to control viruses. They spread by aphids, which are little insects. We'll show some aphids later. Leafhoppers, whitefly, mealybugs, thrips, beetles, nematodes, mechanical. Sometimes when a grower is growing plants in their greenhouse, they'll require you to wipe your shoes on a mat that has at least some sterile material. I mean, the only thing that can kill viruses is either real strong, almost like chlorine bleach like we use, or alcohol like we use for wiping our hands for COVID, and that, but we can't put that on plants because it wouldn't go systemic. Some people might think it does, but it doesn't go systemic, and it would kill the plant, just like chlorine bleach would kill us if we took a little gulp of that. And vegetated propagation would be one way, and seeds. A lot of times viruses are in seeds. And again, companies will test for that, make sure they don't spread it. But if you bought or got seeds from a neighbor or someone across the country who said, buy my seed, and they didn't test for it, maybe you'd get contaminated seed. What are the some of the ways we get around that? There's no chemicals, but there are some cultivars. They can cross plants and work to get that out of there resistantly. They can clean the seeds. Sometimes they'll do it for you. There's no one size. Again, sometimes the virus is just on the outside of the seed. So if you know that that's the case, sometimes you can dip them in alcohol or bleach for a minute or two. I wouldn't do it just randomly because too much can kill the seed, or making sure things are sanitized, or controlling those vectors. If you've got insects in your crop, sometimes you need to kill those insects or at least control them. There's nematodes. Let's get through nematodes and we'll take a little break. Nematodes are those worms. Now the size of this looks huge on the screen, but really when I teach nematodes, I say, imagine this is your eyelash and then cut it into 10 pieces, and that's about the size of the nematodes that can get into plants. They're very small, but they're not as small as viruses. Now take another look and you see this, the head of the nematode has this, and it's a pretty stout little piece. And the ones that infect plants can push that right in, almost like a hypodermic needle, and it can suck out juices, but it can also put fungi. If it builds up some fungi here, it can push fungi in there. It can push in a virus if viruses can populate inside their body. This happens to be a female right here. This is a female vulva, they call it. And what else? Oh, this is pretty cool. I used to have to count these things for many, many years because we did a project with soybeans, tomatoes, different things. And they're not easy to see under the microscope. And there's not that many problems in our vegetables, fortunately. If I can move this to the next slide. There we go. So they're sometimes just called parasitic roundworms. They're found in soil, leaf litter, water, plant surfaces, plant tissue, on or inside animals, but those aren't the ones that get into our plants. They feed on every type of biological creature. And 10%, I would put it less than that, but I'll go along with them. 10% are plant parasites. I think it's 99.9 are good nematodes. You know, we need the bacteria, we need the fungi, we need all these creatures to break down material in our world. And like I said, just a few of them are problematic to our plants. There's a good shot of how that pushes through into the plant. And there's teachers, professors, just about at any agricultural school that's all they do is teach and do research on nematodes. That shows you how big of a problem they are. And mostly in our corn, in our bigger crops, there's tomatoes that get a lot of them. There's eggs. They become little worms. They become bigger worms. And then there's a male and female, and they make more eggs. So it's a pretty simple little animal, but they can be nasty. Egg, usually the egg is small. Juveniles look like that. You can't tell that they're males and females. When they get a little bigger, you can. That is I don't see how to determine on that one. I don't see the vulva. Come on, slide, move. Okay. And sometimes they turn into bigger structures. This is a female that gets fat and full of eggs, and that's one that occurs on root knot, where in the roots, it gets inside the roots and becomes this big structure. And that's where it pushes and causes distortion. You can see all the little knots on this outside of this carrot. And it can be on tomatoes. I think it's the same nematode that can get on carrots and tomatoes. I think that one can and it caused distortion, that sort of thing. There it is on, let's see if that's, yeah, that's on pepper. And it spreads by, they're swimming little creatures when it's when they're in that larvae stage or immature stage. They can get on boots and equipment. Sometimes they can get on the tires of crops. For the big farmers, they have to wash the wheels on their equipment that they go in and out. Else they can be a pretty big problem. If you were a scout or a farm manager, you would basically, you could put booties on, you could clean your shoes between fields. You just don't want to walk from one person's crops to another. And you can manage them with resistance. Resistance pops up in just about everything, right? Rotation usually can kill them. You can add more organic matter. And basically what you're doing there is putting a lot of those good nematodes, you know, I say the 99%, you're adding and putting those against those bad guys. Sometimes solarization works. You lay a sometimes it's a clear plastic, sometimes it's a black plastic. That works a little bit, but I don't know if we get hot enough sunlight to really do a real good job of that. And there's even grafting that goes on. Grafting tomatoes. We've heard of grafting fruit trees, but grafting tomatoes, that's an interesting one. And then there's some chemical. There are some nematode, but it's not available for homes. Sometimes they fumigate the soil. They tarp it over and put a chemical, a gas, and sometimes that works. It works for crops, mostly in a commercial setting. Strawberries are big in that. And okay, let's take a break right here with insects. Let me stop sharing. We can look at the chat and see if there's any questions. Let's see. Stop sharing.
We've had some questions. I think along the way we've been able to answer most of them. You had the carrots with the nematode knots. Somebody asked if they were still edible.
Oh, sure. I mean, you could carve it off and eat them. They're not going to hurt you. I don't know. I feel a little wormy when I eat one of those. I hope there's enough that I can pick some better ones. If I'm really struggling to find, you know, give those to the, I don't know, creatures, pigs, or whatever you got around the yard.
Sometimes the disease part of the plant can be cut out before you eat and salvage part of it if you wanted to.
That's what we did on the farm in the old days, right?
Yep. It's not impossible to get it out.
If anybody wants to take a bathroom break or a
Yes,
nightcap.
but I also have a question for you. You mentioned earlier about the root rot, and you say that the fungicides doesn't really work on those like root rot. So if you find a plant that has a root rot, what do you do? Cut out that portion or take out the whole plant? Then what do you do?
Usually you take out the whole plant if it's getting that bad, and you examine it to see what it looks like. First, document that it is a root rot. Then, I mean, lots of times it's a wet part of your field that leads to that. It could mean if you've got too many like that, it could mean that you maybe have to look for some resistant varieties. There are a few drenches, but I really don't, at a homeowner level, I don't think that's a really good, sometimes that's a possibility in a greenhouse, but greenhouses usually produce their plants so quickly that they don't run into that. They shouldn't run into root rots. But there's a whole variety of plants. For instance, there's one called, well, when you start some seeds, let me, Sheldon, help me. Okay, when you put the seed, damping off, that's what it is. Okay, when you put seeds in, let's say you're starting some seeds that you're going to put out in the garden. You probably had this happen, and the seeds get up to be about, I don't know, a couple inches out of the ground or out of the little pot that you started, and then they just fall over and you wonder what happened. Well, they could have got a fungi. In the old days, we didn't have a nice potting soil that we got from a garden center. And sometimes people try to use their soil, they just take a shovel and, I don't want to say they're cheap, but they're trying to start plants with the soil that they have in their yard. And that's a possibility. But a lot of times they'll run into all those seeds won't germinate and they won't grow very well. In the old days, we put some of that soil in a stove. I don't think my wife would let me put any soil in the stove these days. But
It's probably not a good smelling option sometimes.
yeah, and a lot of greenhouses would have a steam bath or a steamer that you could put the soil in a steamer. And the idea was not to sterilize it. The idea was to pasteurize it like you do for milk. Milk is pasteurized. It's not sterilized. And all you're doing at a heat that's going to kill the bad bacteria or fungi, and it's going to maintain the good, rich content, I guess, of the soil. So yeah, there's a lot of tricks that go on in that. And a lot of our soils, or they're not even called soils, they're basically in peat moss and mixes that a company can sell to a homeowner, and they're pretty cheap, and you can grow a lot of seeds, and that's the way to do it. Yeah, that's a tough one. The root rots can be a scourge of somebody, and you really want to get them out of there, and you want to try to amend. A lot of times you have to make a raised bed to get them out of the deeper soil. And if you run into a problem that you constantly have root rots, it's going to last there. All those structures that I showed there could last 10 years or more, very long time.
Well, let's say you have an established plant, let's say tomato, and it's already bearing fruit and all those. And then let's say it has a little bit root rot. Will it help in your experience? I don't know what you did with it. Will it help if you make the soil drier? Will that help with the root rot?
Yeah, I mean,
No.
at that point, it's probably, I won't say too late, but you're in a race. Is the root rot going to beat you to your crop? And so that's what you're up against. If it's starting to wilt and droop and your fruit is still green, the fungus will probably win. But I mean, you got to decide how are you going to. Yeah, it's better to water. That's why we tell people, if you're in a situation where you're watering, make sure you don't water too much. People get it, especially with gardens or turf. If you start watering every day, and your soils are heavy, and if you start getting root rot, you could be in trouble. So you want to make sure you water. I would say always be on the lean side. In other words, be on the dry side. Plants can survive dry much better than they can survive wet.
Oh, okay. Good to know.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah. The trick here, or the rule of thumb, is 1 inch of water per week. And always look ahead. If the water, it looks like it's going to rain and the plants are just drooping a little bit, but tomorrow they say a little bit of rain, have your rain gauge right in your garden and see how much you get. If you get a 1/2 inch, maybe you only have to water a little bit just to get them from drooping.
Okay.
Or wait, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So let's jump in and do the insects.
Hold on, Tom. You got one.
Okay.
One of the participants happens to be in your county. Just asked if it would be possible to get contact information because he's got something specific in his garden later on that you all might need to discuss.
Sure. Anytime, any place, night or day. Isn't that the way we're working nowadays, Sheldon? And yeah, let's see if we can move along. Insects. Can everyone see that?
No.
You can't see it?
It looks good on my end.
Oh, okay. I just can't get the slides to move. There we go. Okay, we're into insects now. Can everyone see it now?
I
Yes.
see it on my end, yes.
Okay, good. But okay, insects. Insects are bigger usually. They chew and they pierce with their mouth parts. They suck juices, and sometimes they vector, which means they transfer all those little things we talked about when we were talking about fungi, bacteria, and viruses. So, and here's that picture of the worst plant you could ever find, but we're talking about insects now. And let me get this thing out of the way. And so again, they can be anywhere. They can be top or bottom. See my cursor. Let's see. Every time I futz around with my my thing, it stops. There we go. There we go. Chewing, sucking, roots, everything. Galls. Galls are just spots or harder spots, bigger spots than the leaf. And some of them can actually get inside the plant. Some can lay eggs on the plant. Some can cause diseases. There's a whole variety, and you've probably seen quite a few of these in your garden or in your house. But insects are just so diverse. I'm always amazed that we're living in a world with creatures like this. You know, they're almost go back to, and they do lots of times, they go back way before we were around in this world. They're almost like they're adapted to just any part of nature. Just beautiful. I think they're so beautiful, but they're adapted to so many different parts. There's 300,000 beetles. There's 120,000 flies. Probably not in Tennessee, but this is worldwide. We probably have 30,000, probably a tenth of these. We've got quite a bit of variety in Tennessee because we're right there in the middle of everything. And all these little scale, white flies, scale, more scale. Okay, if you're looking at just an insect, you probably know that insects have 6 legs. Sometimes it looks like they have more because they might have antennae or something that make it look a little bit more. They have a head, they have a thorax in the middle, and then they have a bottom, which is abdomen. You don't have to know all that, but it's nice to know because sometimes they'll, for identification, they use some of those things. They're cold-blooded, which means they often go away a little bit when it gets warm, but they often want to go into a warm area. That's why they try to get into our house. All those different stink bugs try to get into our house, or ladybugs try to get into our house because they're trying to seek a little bit of warmth. They have an exoskeleton. That means their hard parts are on the outside of their bodies, usually. They have 3 divisions: head, thorax, and abdomen. And the thorax has 3 segments. And that's where the legs are attached. 2 pair, 1 pair, or none. And 1 pair of segmented antennae. So you see that antennae are things coming out of their head, and they're segmented. There's a lot of details here. And then 1 pair of compound eyes. So a lot of the spiders and things have more eyes. Now for next week, for the test, I want you to memorize all these 32 pieces. No, really, I just want you to know about the 3 things or 4 things or whatever are in yellow. And so maybe 5 things. We want to look at the antennae. We want to look at the eyes. We want to look at the wings and the mouth parts. And basically, we just know that they have these things. We don't have to know too much about them. The other thing is how they develop. They're going to start from eggs. They're going to hatch. They're going to become a little stage. In this case, this is called incomplete. They're going to be a little baby, almost like a nematode. They're not going to look that much different than the adults. And they're going to do some things called molting, which means that they just get rid of that exoskeleton. They just keep going. Maybe they'll do it 5 times and they'll become an adult. The adult will mate with the male and the female, and they'll produce eggs. They don't always mate. Sometimes they, and these are what they call true bugs. Now, yeah, here's gradual. Cicadas, we're gonna have cicadas in May, Mother's Day, so be ready for those. I think you guys are gonna get them, maybe. Aphids are another, we'll show aphids, we'll show some scale. But there's egg again, the little nymph. It doesn't have very, then it gets some wax and it just goes in a little life cycle. And that's going to be different than this one. This is complete. And you probably learned maybe in school, you start with the egg, you get a little worm-like thing called a larvae. The larvae molts like we did in the other one, maybe 3rd, 4th, 5th. Then it has an overwintering stage, either called pupa, chrysalis, breaks out of that, becomes something either not just always a butterfly, fleas and wasps and bees do something very similar. And they lay eggs and they go in the cycle. So that's called complete. And here it is again in a little different way. You got the eggs, you got the larvae. What's missing here? That overwintering structure. Yeah, the pupa. And that, if you were thinking about controlling these in your garden, the pupa would be the hardest one because it's a very hard coat. Chemicals wouldn't penetrate that very well. If you tried to go after the moth, it's going to flutter away and fly away. Sometimes you can put on oil or soapy things to get the eggs. And sometimes you can hit this one because it's crawling around. Sometimes you can take your fingers and pull those off. We do that a lot with some of the things in our garden. Or sometimes you can just spray that and hit them directly with a chemical that'll just kill them. It shows our beautiful monarch butterfly and how it does all the stages. And a lot of times you can see these in your garden. You want to try to encourage these in your garden. They'll be on milkweeds, but there's other butterflies and things that could be similar. So here's a lot of the pests. There's maggots, which are little wormy things that are in the soil. Yeah, a lot of these things are underground. These are the soil insects. And a lot of them have a stage that also eats the plant on the top too. We'll talk about some of those. Here's early season insects. Yeah, some of them come up quicker than others. There's beetles, there's aphids, there's different bugs. Here's a very, very common one. And this one I talked about before. It's a little aphid, and it can produce without sex. It produces parthenogenically. And I've got a little video here that shows that. Might have to turn up your volume.
Aphids inflict serious damage to a variety of crops. They are notorious virus vectors and have an enormous reproductive capacity.
Can you hear that?
There are lots of different
Yes.
species,
Yes.
Okay.
and they occur
Good.
in all kinds of crops. Nymphs and adults extract food materials from the plant and disturb the balance of the plant's growth hormones. It can result in deformed leaves or even the death of young plants. Aphids secrete honeydew, which is a nutrient source for sooty molds. Their saliva can also induce strong allergic reactions, such as malformations of the growing tips. The aphid in this video is the most important vector of viruses and is thus feared by many growers. When reproduction is asexual, the young aphids are born as developed nymphs. They immediately start to feed on plant sap and grow rapidly. Aphids molt 4 times before reaching adulthood. With each molt, they shed white skin, betraying their presence in the crop. Adult aphids can have different appearances. They can vary in color and can be winged or wingless. The most effective method to control aphids depends on species, crop, and climate. Check out our YouTube channel and website for.
So that was a pretty cool video on aphids, and it shows you that, yeah, I mean, even on tomatoes, sometimes you can just take a strong spray and spray them off. And when they land in the soil, they'll just dry up. Sometimes you have to use chemicals. Here is a variety common insect pests of vegetables. Wow, all those stink bugs, whiteflies, hornworms, lots of names. And again, you don't have to know all these, but when you see something, then what I would do, if you can find one that's, stable, some of these are big enough where you can scrape a bunch and put them on a sheet of white paper, or maybe a little tan paper, a gray paper would be even better. And get your phone out and use a little app called iNaturalist. And you probably get a good, they might even name it for you really good. And it's called iNaturalist. I don't know if you've been introduced to that yet. Or just, if it's on potato and it looks like a beetle, just type in on the Google form there, say potato beetle, and see what happens. And chances are you'll get the beetles that are on potato, and probably the one that is going to be the problem is Colorado potato beetle. So there's different ways to identify. And once you identify, then you can type that in and get the whole life cycle and try to see what they suggest, either in a bulletin and how they use to control it. So there's a lot of, here's our hornworm. You can see it's really a wasp that's well, actually this is how it gets parasitized. The wasp goes around and looks for those hornworms, and the next thing you know, it lays eggs on the hornworms. And these are the cocoons. These are the pupa that come out of the hornworm. So if you've got these in your garden, then you want to try to avoid too many sprays, because this is giving you biological control. We talked about that. And here's the beautiful moth. That's actually the hornworm moth. So yeah, then there's other beneficial insects that are predators, parasites, pollinators. So to attract these beneficials, you want to first avoid pesticides. Some may be needed at certain spots. You want to have shelter where there's extra beds. Maybe some rocks will help certain insects hide. Turf grass can sometimes be good or bad. There should be some water. A lot of times we'll say that maybe you should have some flowers in your or nearby your garden, because that's usually where a lot of beneficials can reproduce in some really tiny little flowers. And some of those are vegetables and some are just flowers. What do we got here?
All the insects, including the dragonfly, have a flexible wing. They're master of using this kind of a flexible structure for their maximum aerodynamic benefits. So flying actually, it has been a very old topic in terms of the human design and research history. Researchers who are working on the design of small flying robots have discovered rigid wings have limited their flying abilities. This is why my research is looking at the flexible wings of dragonflies and other insects to try to discover the source of the efficient and highly maneuverable flight.
So we have 3 high-speed cameras, and we're going to put the dragonflies on that platform and let it free fly. And when it starts flying, we push the trigger and record all the motions.
We are trying to track the information of the insect wings and also build up the 3-dimensional model and develop newer numerical schemes trying to handle such complex geometry and complicated motion.
That's totally amazing to me. Management, how do you, there's cultural things. You want to attract those beneficials. Maybe there's some barriers. You put a cover over some of your vegetables to keep the butterflies out or to keep the beetles out. Sometimes you plant different things together. They call it companion planting. Some of that works. There's even books that are written on which plants to be next to each other. Get rid of weeds. Sometimes picking them off or paying your, we paid our kids a penny a piece to pick off the hornworms. I think the price has gone up to maybe 10 cents or whatever. Prune out, solarization, rotation, remove debris at the end of the season. That's usually, and gosh, are we there yet? I didn't know if we, oh, I don't think we're quite done. But here's kind of a cute little cartoon. Some of the management, there's things called biological. If you haven't heard about it, it's something it's called BT. It's Bacillus thuringiensis is the Latin name, but everyone calls it BT. And there's several of these that are basically made out of, or they're bacterial, that it's a toxin. It's basically a dead bacteria. But if you spray that on larvae of basically caterpillar larvae, it gets in there and can cause death of those larvae. So it's good for those hornworms. It's not good for everything. Some things it'll work for and some things won't. You can release beneficials, but I'm not really big on buying beneficials from a store and releasing them. If you do a garden really properly, you'll have plenty of those. If you have nice little flower beds, and usually pick the small little flowers, like some of the crops. I'm trying to think of some of those. I've got a list, but the smaller the better. It seems like all the little tiny wasps. You think of wasps stinging you, but these wasps don't sting at all because they're solitary. They don't have a nest like yellow jackets or bigger wasps, but they're tiny. They're only as small as a there's maybe like 1/8 of an inch, and they're basically cruising your garden for any of those aphids, any of those beetles. Very beneficial. If you're going to use some chemicals, there's some bulletins that are out there that UT has, or Georgia, or North Carolina. I would use either one of those, or anyone in our area would probably be good to pick chemicals. But again, shy away from those if you're a homeowner, because most of the time, I say share and share alike. Let the insects have a few things, but you can probably do real well by just doing biological control. Here's what Bacillus thuringiensis is. It's a naturally occurring bacteria discovered a long time ago, and it's pretty much, a lot of people use it as what they would call a natural organic type of a control. And there's some other ones that are similar to this. So in summary, diseases in plants have 3 factors: understanding what the pathogen or pest is a foundation for control. I always say identify, identify, identify. Try to figure out what it is, what the problem is before you even consider a control. A lot of people get ahead of the game and try to say, oh, I know what that is, but no, try to figure out exactly what's going on there. And if you need some help, this is called the Soil Plant and Pest Center. You probably are sending your soil samples to them, but this is a good place also to send your disease and insects. It costs $15, and maybe Sheldon, or even you could send some things to me by email. There's a place called Distance Diagnostics that Sheldon can take your picture and put it on a listserv or a server, and then that picture can go up to this lab, and they can often diagnose it that way too, and that's free. You can do that for free. Let's see. Yeah, and there's a Facebook page. Oh, their Facebook page is really cool, because if you go there, they're usually a step ahead of us, and they're saying, oh, I found this in my crop. And it's good for anything, trees, shrubs, vegetable gardens. And if you look in there, you'll learn so much about different problems that are coming in right now. In this one, I think it was saying, oh, salvia. I don't know what this one was, but sometimes we get something new every year, and the diagnostic clinic they've won awards for their Facebook page. It's really cool. I think that's it. Oh, this one. Yeah, always understand that insects anyway can have different shapes, and I thought this is a good way to end it. Always identify what you're up against. So if anybody has any questions, I'm glad I ended before. I usually run over on some of these things, so I don't want to keep anybody from supper, that's for sure. So it's
I don't know where to get it right yet. My son is one that told me he uses it up north.
What's that?
Yeah, a product is organic. Yeah, it's called Captain Jack.
Oh, what's it made of?
I do not know, but he swears by it.
That's right.
On cabbage and tomatoes and everything like that.
How much stock does he own?
I don't know, but he said you can just spray it on and you go ahead and eat the vegetable right afterwards.
Well, there's a lot of things. There's things out there. First, look at the label and see if it's labeled for that product. See if it's a chemical that, every chemical is got to be registered with the Environmental Protection Agency. They have to have a date that you can use it and then eat it. So that's on there. The label is what you need to know. If you're going to spray something like that, look into it.
It takes about 2 days for it to work.
Yeah.
It doesn't work immediately.
Yeah, read up about it. So many things are okay, but so many things are just a ploy to get you to buy it, and maybe it'll work, maybe it won't.
Well, he uses it for several years now, and he swears by it.
Well, yep. All you can say is, yep. Does it work?
Yep.
All right, thank you.
Captain Jack, I'll have to write that one down and do a little research. I like to do a little research, but as a master, any other questions on gardening?
In one of the somebody commented, but I also found Captain Jack is spinosad.
Okay, and some of those, that's one that's been tested and trained. A lot of those need to be applied at the right time, to the right stage of an insect.
And I forgot offhand, but there is, depending on the crop, several crops that have a pre-harvest interval.
Right.
7 days on most fruit. Asparagus 60 days.
Wow.
Bushberries and caneberries is 3 days. Most of your citrus, cold crops, and fruiting vegetables such as okra and tomatoes, etc., is 1 day.
Yeah.
Cucurbits 3 days.
Yeah, read the label and yeah, use it. I mean, I wouldn't be against using it. I would just be a little bit, yeah.
It's pretty effective on Colorado potato beetle.
Is it?
Yes,
Isn't there a special one that's for Colorado potato beetle?
that's what I used the last time I had a problem with them, and I had a problem with them,
Yeah,
and this worked.
yeah. That's good. Yeah.
In fact, the
You can't
bottle
pick-
said Colorado potato beetle buster, and it's spinosad.
Ah,
And then right next to it was the general garden vegetable spray, same ingredient,
all right.
Yep.
Yeah, because
different concentrations, but same ingredient.
well, one of the tricks that if you're going to use control chemicals for diseases, fungi, bacteria, or insects, it's wise to alternate, to use one maybe for a certain period of time, maybe one period of time, and then stop, and then do something else. Usually you leave your best one for last, and you try to use milder ones, so to speak, soapy stuff, maybe some, some of the soaps can be used on vegetables. Spinosad would be a mild one. That's considered, I don't know if it's in the organic
It
category,
is.
but it would be, yeah, try to use those. And then if that doesn't work, alternate it with, or if it's working, alternate it with some soap and try to, I don't know if there's ever been a resistance to spinosad, but almost anything can become resistant. So we didn't even talk about weeds. I guess that's not in this category, but
We
weeds,
talked a little bit about weed control last week.
yeah. Those can be,
Pulling, pulling, and mulching.
yeah, and those can be a very source of insects and diseases as well. So you want to try to keep your weed population as low as possible around, using mulch, using just hand pulling. Ken showed up. All right, Ken. We got somebody's getting married down here too. Starting to see everybody. Very nice picture. I hope that was a recent marriage during COVID, I hope. My daughter's getting married at the end of the year. She was supposed to get married last October. We were going to have a big wedding up in Nashville, and we put it off till this coming October. I hope everything cools down so that'll happen. Looking forward to that. I got a big investment in that wedding. So it's got to happen.
Is she still getting married in Nashville?
Yep.
Does she live in Nashville?
Yep. It's in Franklin. She's getting married.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Like an old mansion place, or no, someplace in Brentwood, I think.
Sounds lovely.
Yeah, it should be nice. Anybody else have any questions? It's kind of hard to think about vegetables in wintertime, but it's actually a good time to get your early season kale. And I had kale that went on all year, all through the winter. Did pretty good.
All right. Thanks, Tom. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Looks like so I'm going to start. I think I got my recording.
I'll share. Again, thank you, Tom, for
Thank you.
being on.
Yes. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank
Thank you very much.
Thank
you. I don't know if my recording, yeah, I guess it did.
I'll share mine if yours didn't. Just like,
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for.
Thank you.
It's a good class.
Appreciate it. Yeah, I love the bugs. I love the fungi. Oh. It says it's recording, but I don't see how to turn it off.
I think it stops when you stop. When
Yeah,
we end the
usually, in my
session.
experience, you can usually turn it off.
I-
But when I go down the record button, it says I can record on this computer. So I hope I didn't. No, I don't think I turned it off unexpectedly. Yeah, I'll tell you. If I did, maybe you could bald it to me or whatever.
Yeah, we'll figure out how to get it to you.
Okay. Thanks a lot, everybody. See you
Well,
later.
thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
Bye-bye. That's Stephanie.
All right. We'll see you all.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.